Behind the Scenes of External Events, Part 1. Many years ago, when I was working in Berlin and happened to be at a play, news of the assassination by an anarchist of the Empress of Austria in Geneva was as though wafted into the theater during the performance. As this news came wafting in during an interval, I found myself standing near a man who was then a theater critic in Berlin, but has since written well-known philosophical books. He was expressing his astonishment in rather a memorable fashion. He said, quote, "You can be understanding about many things in the world, even if you find them unjustified and don't agree with them, but," close quote, "so said the man," continue quote, "it's incomprehensible and serves no purpose for an activist movement to kill a sick woman whose continued life could not have changed things in any important way, and whose death had no obvious connection with any political ideas." Close quote. I think that man was expressing an opinion that must surely be that of any sensible person in today's educated world. Therefore, we might draw the conclusion that things happen amongst human beings, things happen during the course of historical events that appear senseless when measured by the normal standards of life, things that even appear senseless if we try to explain them as some kind of mistake. However, this is the very kind of event, and we could add many, many more to the list, which shows us that something seemingly incomprehensible outwardly must indeed appear incomprehensible outwardly, because there are spiritual forces and spiritual deeds being played out, both for good and evil, behind the scenes, if I may use this expression, of events in world history. Spiritual happenings and spiritual actions which can only be comprehended if spiritual science can be used to throw light on the realms that lie behind the scenery of everyday life, as it runs its course in the sense-perceptible world. These things that happen can only be comprehended on the basis of ideas from the spiritual world, and they must of necessity appear incomprehensible, whether in a good or an evil sense, if they are viewed only in connection with the sense-perceptible world. So if one has an experience like this one in a theater, which might be called a coincidence, but could perhaps also be a symbolic guise for something karmic, then one is inclined to ponder on how different things look behind the scenes in comparison with what is being presented on the stage. These remarks are intended as a starting point for what I want to say today, which I shall also enlarge on further the next time we gather here. I shall talk now about what it is important for people to know in connection with all kinds of things that take place behind the scenery of events here on the physical plane. If one wanted to fit in with today's lazy way of describing only in general terms what lives in the spiritual world and is connected with human affairs here on earth, one would be unable to make them comprehensible, for we can only understand these things if we go right into concrete, actual facts of the spiritual world. As you know, and has been described and written about many times, we structure human evolution according to different periods. Great periods, such as the old Saturn, Sun, and Moon times, and so on, and smaller periods, such as the Lemurian and Atlantean ages and our post-Atlantean period. Even these smaller periods are tremendously long, and within them we speak of cultural epochs, which for our post-Atlantean period are the ancient Indian, ancient Persian, the Egypto-Chaldean, the Greco-Latin epochs, and our present fifth post-Atlantean age. We speak of these periods because in progressing through earthly evolution, humanity as a whole changes its, in this case, soul, SOUL, characteristics from one period to the next. Humanity undergoes a real development in each such period, by which I now mean the smallest of the periods mentioned. Every such period imposes obligations on humanity as to what must be experienced, what must cause joy or sorrow, what must be learned, where the source of its will impulses lies, and so on. The task is to be tackled by the Egypto-Chaldean cultural epoch. The task to be tackled by the Egypto-Chaldean cultural epoch differed from that facing the Greco-Latin one, and our own age also has quite specific tasks. We can properly view the differences in the tasks facing these successive epochs with regard to the characteristics to be developed. Specifically, those to be discussed today, we can view these properly if we try to include in our considerations the experiences that belong to human life as a whole, and not only those that are important for external evolution, to which today's materialistic view wants to restrict itself. What is experienced externally by human beings on the physical plane is only one part of overall human life, which takes its course not only between birth and death, but also between death and a new birth. Life on the physical earth does not on its own give us the full picture of the successive epochs. In reality, the forces from the realm in which human beings spend their time between death and a new birth always come down and interact with the forces unfolded by them while they are here on the physical plane. What is involved is always an interplay between the forces unfolded by human beings after death and those which they unfold here on the physical plane. Throughout the whole period of the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, it was in order for human beings to be kept unaware about certain things. But many of the things about which the people of the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, the Greco-Latin epoch, could be kept unaware are the very ones of which the human beings of the fifth post-Atlantean epoch must become more and more conscious. In fact, this fifth post-Atlantean age will anyway be one in which much that was formerly outside consciousness will have to enter into the consciousness of human souls. Such developments take place in accordance with certain spiritual laws. They are governed by a certain spiritual necessity. Humanity is simply predisposed in such a way that certain capacities of understanding and also certain forces of will develop at a specific time. During the fifth post-Atlantean age, humanity will become ready for certain things, just as it became ready for other things in earlier periods. Humanity becomes ready for these things. One such matter for which the humanity of this fifth post-Atlantean age is becoming ready is something that people today find especially paradoxical, because a large part of today's public opinion is striving in the very opposite direction, and is wanting to guide people in this opposite direction, but it cannot be avoided. The spiritual forces that are inoculated into humanity, if I may use this phrase, during the course of the fifth post-Atlantean period, will be stronger than certain people will wish, and stronger than what public opinion expects. One matter that will assert itself powerfully will be the possibility for humanity to be guided more in accordance with occult principles than has ever been the case before. It is characteristic of this development that during this fifth post-Atlantean age, certain conditions of power, certain strong capacities to be influential, must become concentrated in small groups of people who will have much power over other larger masses. Part of today's public opinion is working strongly to counteract this, but it will develop anyway, for a specific reason. It will develop because during the fifth post-Atlantean age, a large part of humanity will, out of what is maturing in its soul, out of what is necessary for the evolution of humanity, develop certain spiritual capacities, namely a certain natural ability to look into the spiritual world. This part of humanity will certainly represent the best basis for what is to come in the sixth post-Atlantean age, the age that will follow our present one. But in the fifth post-Atlantean age, during which it is making these preparations, this part of humanity will have little inclination to turn its attention strongly to matters of the physical plane. It will be concerning itself a great deal with bringing the life of heart and soul onto a higher level, and putting certain spiritual matters in order. And because of this, others, who are rather less suited to such spiritual life, will be enabled to seize certain conditions of power for themselves. There is a degree of inevitability about this, and it is something that was much discussed during the final third of the 19th century in those circles who know about such things. There was constant discussion of the urgent necessity to ensure that this possibility should be guided not into evil, but into good paths. During the final third of the 19th century, and especially as the turn to the 20th century was approaching, occultists of every persuasion were heard to say, preparations must be made so that those who attain the power to act may be the ones who are worthy of it. Obviously, except in the case of very few circles, those closest to the speaker, for whatever worldly reason, were the ones seen as worthy. Amongst occultists, this subject was as topical then as it is in a certain sense today. There are others, too, that will come out and become known to people, and enter into their will during the fifth post-Atlantean age, simply because human beings have reached the stage in their development where they are ready for them. These things are more far-reaching. In fact, they are so far-reaching that they must be of serious concern to all those who are conversant with such matters. During the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, the human being's physical apparatus for thinking will become mature enough to comprehend fully certain elements connected with diseases, certain processes of healing, and connections between natural processes and diseases. Those who know about these matters are concerned because they must adopt the goal of ensuring that the individuals who will be chosen to bring teachings and impulses about such things out into the open will do so in a proper and dignified manner. For there will be two possibilities. Either it will be possible to put out information about these things in a way that leads to calamity for the world, or it will be possible for them to be taught in a way that leads to welfare in the world. These things are connected with the inmost essence of certain conditions in human procreation, and certain conditions connected with diseases, and also with certain conditions relating to the advent of death. By being made known to humanity, these things become weighty thoughts and impulses and are very significant indeed. Meanwhile, the purpose of this fifth post-Atlantean age is to bring the degree of freedom to human beings which they will need in order to receive enlightenment about certain matters that have hitherto lived more in the subconscious realm of their soul, and also to enable them to master these things. Those who know about such things have been at great pains to consider what is feasible or can be done in the one or the other direction. For everything that can be done in these matters conveys a degree of power and a possibility of participating in human affairs in far-reaching ways. With regard to the development of the fifth post-Atlantean age, these matters have, as I mentioned earlier, been very much to the fore within the esoteric streams of the 19th century, right up to our own time. There is also another fact that those who know about it regard as very important, so that because of its importance they must bring it into connection with various others. I've mentioned this in lectures from time to time. When you have stepped across the threshold to the spiritual world and are making spiritual observations there, you find that single facts, always individual facts, appear before your soul. It then transpires that facts which at first sight appear to the spiritual eye, EYE, to have nothing to do with one another, are actually connected when you grasp their meaning. Such facts illumine and clarify each other, and then enable you to press on further into the essence of the spiritual world in the profoundest sense. A further fact, which I also want to put before you, will at first sight appear completely unconnected with what I have just said. But you will find that this further fact does actually have very much, a very great deal, to do with those things I have just mentioned. This further fact is this. On turning today to the souls of human beings who have died, and on becoming acquainted with what I might call their life situations, in quotes, we find that there are some among them who are extremely worried after death about becoming acquainted with those souls who met their earthly end in situations like that which befell the Empress of Austria in Geneva. In other words, we discover that those who are sent through the gate of death by activists, let us call them this for the moment, represent a great worry for some others who have passed through the gate of death in the normal way and then gone on to have their experiences in the spiritual world. We find that human souls who have passed through the gate of death in the normal way dread, after death, having anything to do with those other souls. They avoid having contact with them. Please do not, in this case, dwell on what must seem to your feelings to be paradoxical about this reaction. There are, of course, so many ways in which souls can meet and have dealings with one another, that it would be misplaced to bring our sympathy into play immediately, even though this would be a justifiable and understandable way to react in such a situation. We have to look objectively at the facts in a case like this. And the fact here is that souls who have had a normal passage through the gate of death shy away from souls who have been guided through the gate of death by the deeds of activists. These two things, this last mentioned fact and what I explained before, are linked, and the link is quite specific. On looking more closely, we find that the souls who have been violently propelled through the gate of death know something in the spiritual world after death which the other souls do not want to learn about from them at the wrong time. They do not want to learn about it sooner than would be beneficial. The situation is that the souls who have passed violently through the gate of death retain something on account of having lost their life in that way here in the physical world. They have retained certain possibilities of being able to make use of forces which they have had here, for instance, the force of the intellect. So, from over there, from the spiritual side, these souls can use the forces that are bound to the physical body and do quite different things with them than can be done with them here in the physical body. This enables them to know certain things sooner than is actually beneficial in the overall process of human evolution. Thus, it is remarkable that what appears to be meaningless, namely a number of those actions by activists, is now revealed to have a meaning, albeit a very dubious one. To those who understand what is going on, these acts appear in rather a strange light. Here, in the physical world, we say a lot of nonsensical things that are supposed to be meaningful, but do not mean anything on closer inspection. Here in the physical world we say, these people, these activists who murder people, are only doing it in order to draw attention to the misery in the world. It is a means of incitement and so on. But if you analyze the matter and try to bring it into the context of social laws, you notice immediately that none of this has any meaning. It becomes meaningful, however, if you know that souls sent up into the spiritual world by such means understand things up there which they ought not to understand yet, and which souls who have died in the normal way even shy away from. Of course, what then suggests itself is that on the basis of information, such as is available, regarding the murder of the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, one should investigate esoterically the various assassinations that have been taking place, so as to discover what is going on in connection with those souls who arrive in the spiritual world as the keepers, as it were, of certain secrets that can have consequences, about which we shall speak in a moment. Those who examine the sequence of these assassinations purely externally are likely to conclude that the selection has come about by chance. But if you analyze the matter and look at the individuals who have been dispatched to their death in this way, you realize that they must have been selected on purpose, though not on the basis of criteria applying to the physical world, but rather on the basis of criteria applying to the spiritual world. However, on investigating a large number of known assassinations with this in mind, one comes up with something very peculiar. On looking at Carnot, at the Empress Elizabeth, and a good many others, something very peculiar becomes evident. What becomes evident is that, although, as I have described, there was a possibility of achieving something through these assassinations, it has not been achieved. Nothing of it has been achieved. It would have been achieved if souls had been found who would, so to speak, have been willing to receive what was on offer. Both parties would then have become involved in a transcendental, supersensible guilt. The souls who had passed through death in the normal way would have learned about things which would have driven them in directions through which they would have become guilty. And those who had gone into death violently by means of assassinations would have made themselves guilty through having disclosed something which it is not yet possible to disclose. Higher spiritual beings, higher hierarchies, prevented this, because from a certain point of view the consequences would have been such that they needed to be averted for the good of a certain portion of humanity. The damage that would have been done by these things was prevented, so to speak, by the intervention of higher spiritual beings. So what we find here is an attempt made with unsuitable means, or means that were deprived of their suitability, an attempt to do something in the spiritual world behind the scenes of our usual physical world. On delving even further into these matters, we find the source of these impulses. In the greater part of the assassinations that have become known to you and have been discussed in Europe, the impulses, by which I mean the spiritual impulses, were not the original ones. They were derived from something else. They were, to put it simply, measures of defense. The purpose was to avert something else. These deeds were intended as a way of preventing other deeds along the same lines from being carried out, or rather, of preventing the consequences of such deeds from taking effect. This is a very mysterious matter, and this whole matter only becomes comprehensible if we consider what it was that had to be prevented, what it was against which these preventive measures had to be taken. We are looking here through spiritual science into matters that are profoundly connected with the impulses of present and future human life, about which it is extraordinarily difficult to speak, because everywhere they go against certain naive and also justified interests that people have. This whole matter only becomes comprehensible when we bear in mind that everything I have so far told you, that all these ventures of assassination I have so far mentioned, were actually guided amateurishly in a dilettante fashion, without thorough knowledge of the occult circumstances, because They were born out of a kind of fear as preventive measures and were also not guided uniformly. This whole matter only becomes comprehensible if we examine what it was that had to be deflected. As such, this has already been striven for and set in motion by means involving greater insight. Right up into the 19th century, there existed in the East a remarkable order, the Thugs. This order, which flourished in a part of Asia, had not come into being simply out of the longing in the hearts of its members to achieve certain aims. The members of this order were obliged to murder certain individuals indicated to them by superiors who very, very strongly maintained their anonymity. The order was a kind of murderer's order, which had the task of murdering certain individuals. Its activity simply manifested in the way one heard, from time to time, that one person or another had been murdered. The murder was committed when a member of the order of Thugs was instructed by anonymous superiors to murder such and such an individual. Those in authority who set such things in train knew very well what goal they were pursuing. First, they arranged the affairs of the physical plane in such a way that this order of murderers could come into being. And then they arranged the affairs of the order of murderers itself in such a way that its purposes could be carried out. The goal of all this was to make those human beings pass through the gate of death violently, who would thus be equipped with the capacity that would enable them after death to know certain secrets. Those who arranged all this then also, on the other hand, set up here on the physical plane corresponding mirror events, as they are called in occult life. Their purpose is to set up corresponding mirror events here on the physical plane. Such events have indeed to some small extent already been set up here on the physical plane. This is done as follows. Certain suitable individuals are schooled to be mediums. They are then put into a trance, and the streams coming from the spiritual world are guided to the medium by certain methods, in such a way that the medium makes known certain secrets that cannot be made known in any other way. The only way they can be made known is when a person who has been violently killed uses over in the other world certain forces which have remained usable as a result of the violent death. As a soul, that person comes to understand the secrets and allows them to seep into the medium. Those here on earth who have an interest in finding out about such things can then find out more about what such souls allow to seep into the medium. The things that are researched in this way are, in a sense, what I might call spiritual premature births. Souls who have passed through the gate of death in the normal way know, if they then meet with the opportunity to come into contact with such things, that their time has now come to prepare themselves. And they show that they are preparing themselves, so that at a later time, when humanity will have reached the right stage of maturity, they will be ready to bring down certain matters from the spiritual world to the earth and inoculate them into the earth down here. Indeed, it is actually an important task for a number of people who are now passing through the gate of death to use, when they have become mature enough for certain secrets, the normal forces in connection with those secrets, rather than learn about them through a foreshortened experience by using forces brought into play by a violent death. These human souls do indeed have the task of finding out about these forces and inspiring people who are here on the earth with them, people who are not mediums, but who should find out about them in a normal and proper way through inspiration. In normal life, one has to wait for this. When things that ought to come later make their appearance as spiritual premature births by the means I have described, through criminal occult activity, When this happens, those whose intentions toward humanity are not good, in other words, those who are black or gray magicians, can gain possession of such secrets. Such things have indeed been going on behind the scenes of external events during the current decades. The purpose was, firstly, to present certain groups of people with the secret of how to dominate great masses, as I indicated first of all. This secret involves knowing how those masses, who have little interest in external affairs, but who have budding spiritual capacities that can serve in preparing for the sixth post-Atlantean epoch, can be thoroughly dominated, and how such domination can be put into the hands of some few individuals. That was the first purpose. The other is something that will play a great part in the future, namely to get those secrets into one's clutches for the purpose of turning in a certain direction the circumstances that have to do with the processes of disease and also of procreation. I have already mentioned these things to a number of friends. Certain circles in this materialistic age are striving to paralyze and make impossible all of humanity's spiritual development, through causing people by their very temperament and character to reject everything spiritual and regard it as nonsense. A stream of this kind, and it is already noticeable in some isolated individuals, will become deeper and deeper. A longing will arise for there to be a general opinion. Whatever is spiritual, whatever is of the Spirit, is nonsense, is madness. Endeavors to achieve this will be made by bringing out remedies to be administered by inoculation, just as inoculations have been developed as a protection against diseases. Only these inoculations will influence the human body in a way that will make it refuse to give a home to the spiritual inclinations of the soul. People will be inoculated against the inclination to entertain spiritual ideas. Endeavors in this direction will be made. Inoculations will be tested that already in childhood will make people lose any urge for a spiritual life. This is, however, only one of the things connected with a more intimate knowledge that must come about in this fifth post-Atlantean age, regarding the connection of these natural processes and remedies with the human organism. They will make their appearance among humanity at the appropriate time. The decisive question will be what succeeds first, whether the endeavors to let those spiritual premature births get into the hands of individuals for the furtherance of their own purposes, or whether knowledge about these things will come down in the right way for the welfare of humanity when the time is ripe. The organization intending to bring about those spiritual premature births, through working with the help of the thug order of murderers, was not amateurish. It worked very systematically, but in a way that is frightful for anyone whose intentions toward humanity are beneficial. It worked professionally, not amateurishly, and knew all about the appropriate means. Because there were these endeavors to bring down too early from the spiritual world, by certain means, something that must come during the course of human maturity in the fifth post-Atlantean age, and get it into the egoistic possession of a part of humanity, there then arose the anxious uneasiness in others, which came to the fore like a counter-image in the form of activism. But it was amateurish, because it was born of fear. Its intention was to help, but its endeavors made use of unsuitable means. What is going on behind the scenes of external events is very significant. These things would not be under discussion here today if there were not the binding need to draw them to the attention of those who are able to hear what is being said through having had some preparation in the matters of spiritual science. It is necessary for such things to enter into the consciousness of the humanity of the fifth post-Atlantean age, Only if they do enter into the consciousness of the humanity of the fifth post-Atlantean age will those things be achieved, which must be the goal of earthly evolution. The time must come when individuals take up the irksome task of thinking not only in the way thinking is taught by so-called educated people in the universities. A time must come when a number of individuals declare their willingness to take upon themselves this irksome view of the world which derives its direction, its concepts, and its ideas out of the spiritual world. Humanity must not be allowed to remain in the dormant state it wants to retain, with those abstract, generalized concepts, not only striven for, but also called noble by the materialistic age. Anyway, when you consider what I have been pointing out, you realize that there are a good many ways of using the streams coming over from the spiritual world in order to do harm here on the physical earth in the fifth post-Atlantean age. There are a number of possibilities for this, one of which I have pointed out today. And the fact that one must stress the need for some souls to absorb such knowledge consciously ties in with the whole fundamental character of our age. The second half of the 19th century was a very important time. In one circle of our friends or another, I have often pointed out that the year 1841 was a crisis year, a year of decision. This is not obvious if you look only at the events which took place here in the physical world, for it is necessary to see these in conjunction with what is going on in the spiritual world. The year 1841 was indeed a critical year for the introduction of the materialistic age, because that is when a certain battle began in the spiritual world, a battle of certain spirits of darkness, one might call it, who belonged to the hierarchy of the Angeloi. They fought this battle in the spiritual world until the autumn of 1879. They had various specific aims, of which we shall mention only one today. Between 1841 and 1879, the decision was to be taken as to whether a certain sum of spiritual wisdom could be brought to maturity in the spiritual world, so that from the final third of the 19th century onward it could gradually seep down to the earth and enter human souls, and there stimulate spiritual knowledge, knowledge of the kind that today we call the knowledge of spiritual science. Such knowledge has only become possible since the final third of the 19th century. The purpose of those Angeloi spirits between 1841 and 1879 was to prevent the maturing over there in the spiritual world of what was supposed to seep down. But those spirits lost the war they waged for decades against the spirits of light. In 1879, something then took place on a smaller scale, which has taken place repeatedly during the course of evolution, and has always been expressed by a particular symbol, Michael or St. George triumphing over the dragon. In 1879, too, the dragon was overcome in a particular matter. The dragon was those Angeloi beings who strove for but failed to achieve what I have explained. So in 1879, they were thrown out of the spiritual world and into the realm of human beings. This was the fall of the Angeloi beings, from the realm of the spiritual world into the realm of human beings. So now they move about here amongst human beings. They are here, sending their forces into the thoughts, feelings, and will impulses of human beings by making mischief of one kind or another. By losing the battle, they have failed to prevent the arrival of the time when the spiritual wisdom is filtering down. This spiritual wisdom is now here and will continue to develop ever more and more. And then human beings will have the ability to see and comprehend the spiritual world. Those Angeloi beings have now fallen down to the earth. Here they want to do harm with what is filtering down. They want to guide the knowledge into the wrong channels, to rob it of its good powers and send it into bad channels. In short, having failed to achieve what they wanted with the help of spirits, they now want to achieve it here with the help of human beings, because of the fall they experienced in 1879. They want to destroy the good plan for the world, which consists in spreading amongst human beings, when the right moment of maturity has been reached, the knowledge about how to control the masses, and the knowledge about birth, disease, and death, and other things. They want to spread such knowledge too early, by means of those spiritual premature births. They are also busy in other ways, apart from what I have mentioned here. Awareness alone will help us against the influence of these Ahrimanic beings. I have pointed this out many times, especially in the mystery plays. You will remember the final scene of the last one, where we see that the only thing which helps us to counteract Ahriman is to see through him, to know that he is there. The fifth post-Atlantean age must develop to the point at which many individuals can speak to the Ahrimanic powers and beings as Faust does. Quote, "For in thy naught I trust to find thee all." Close quote. The attitude of mind must develop in which one can look into what the materialistic view sees as naught, and there see the spiritual world. If this happened, Ahriman Mephistopheles would be forced to speak to such individuals as he speaks to Faust when he sends him to the mothers. Quote, "I will not grudge my praise before thou goest, and well I see that thou the devil knowest." Close quote. The other day over in Dornach I said in jest that Mephistopheles would never have made such a remark to Woodrow Wilson. To Wilson he would have said, quote, "The devil the vulgar herd ne'er sent, e'en though he have them by the collar." Close quote. What really matters, then, is that people must learn to look and see the concrete events taking place in the spiritual world. But when such a thing is most especially necessary, the forces who want to oppose it are also especially strong. And this then leads people to resist what they should be doing. There is something I beg you to take into account here in Zurich, in connection with your most praiseworthy plan that can be greeted with joy, namely, your plan to bring spiritual science to certain circles who are as yet very negative toward it. What I beg you is that you will not entertain any illusions about this. Much disappointment, indeed initially nothing but disappointment, is what one must expect when one tries to begin in the right way to do things that must be done and have to be done. Nothing must ever prevent us from doing these things. We must be so filled with the impulse, which is the necessary impulse for the present time, that we do what has to be done, regardless of whether the consequences, in this instance too, lead more in the one direction or more in the other. This is the only attitude that can lead to any success. Often what one achieves in one direction is not at all what one intended. I must beg you to realize that one must do far more than seems necessary for the degree of success achieved. This is because making propaganda for spiritual science involves getting involved in something quite different from what is entailed in all the other propagandas put out today in other fields. In other fields, one is, after all, usually telling people about things that they already know, as thoroughly as the worshippers praying in church know about what the pastor is telling them from the pulpit. Most associations have programs that are easily assimilated by people. Usually they remain in the realm of abstraction, beautiful programs that have nothing to do with reality and cannot lead to anything real. To nurture the endeavors of spiritual life in the fifth post-Atlantean age, one must regard them as something that is alive. But look at living creatures, and you will see that spiritual life has a mirror image in natural life. Do the fish in the ocean refrain from laying countless eggs that will perish? Consider how many fish eggs actually turn into fish. Myriads perish. This is how things are in life, and it is also how things are in the spiritual life. For years and years you can speak again and again to huge crowds, but you must be satisfied if amongst all those huge crowds just a few individuals are touched with enthusiasm, for that is how things are in the living world. We can really only achieve something by imitating nature, which is the mirror image of the Spirit. What would happen if nature, having noticed how many eggs perish each year, refrained from allowing all the eggs that perish to be laid in the first place? The process of nature is unceasing, and it is this that leads to evolution. It is not important to consider whether one thing or another can be achieved, whether one person or another has a positive response. What is important is that we regard the matter in hand itself as the impulse, and that we cannot help but bring this impulse out into the world. The reasons, a number of which we have considered in our souls again today, the reasons why one must bring this impulse out into the world of the fifth post-Atlantean age are truly grave enough. And resistance against efforts to do it will be greatest when the need to do it is at its most pressing. As regards the things that happen here on the physical plane, which are just now barbarous indeed, people will have to make the effort to see all these things in conjunction with events that are taking place behind the scenes. Only then will it all become comprehensible. Today's historians, sociologists, economists, and politicians, who derive their rules and laws solely from the physical plane, in comparison with what is really needed today, such people are like someone who, when faced with an onerous task, begins to tackle it by lying down and going to sleep on a couch, thinking that he will manage to do the job in his dreams. This is indeed in most cases how those belonging to the life of culture and the life of the various scientific disciplines set about their work. These are people dreaming their way through reality. How do people now write about history? How do they write about sociology? They write as people do who have no idea about the real forces that lie behind the things they dream about. The source of events as drastic as those taking place in our time surrounds the people who are today concerned with science, like a room surrounds someone who has never seen it because he has been brought into it while asleep, and then goes on sleeping, thus only getting to know the room in his sleep. This is the way in which purely materialistic science gets to know the world. What I have called imaginative consciousness in my book titled The Riddle of Man is something that must, to some degree, come to the humanity of the fifth post-Atlantean age as a matter of course. For certain secrets must come to light, because otherwise they will be spread about amongst people in the wrong way, by means such as I have told you of today. As I have said, it is not easy to point these things out at the present time, but it is a necessary duty to do so. For in many matters one needs to develop a gift of observation that is different from the coarse gift of observation people have these days. There are 2 points I should like to make in connection with what I have been saying. Firstly, people do make some progress today when they endeavor to look at things they would otherwise have regarded as coincidences, but instead of doing this, now take them so seriously that they perceive them as suggestions for a deepening of the soul. Suppose you read of a particular person having died at a specific place and at a specific time. A number of things will suggest themselves to you if you ask yourself what would have happened if that person had died 3 months earlier or 3 months later. This is, of course, merely a question concerning supposed possibilities. But if you ask yourself such a question, you can be sure that it can awaken forces in you, through which you will reach different insights. Or perhaps you are traveling on a train and have a very important conversation with someone, a conversation that means a great deal to you, or something similar. A materialist will, of course, regard such things as pure coincidence. but someone who wants to find his way gradually into being able to look behind the scenery of existence, such a person will pay attention to such things. He will ponder these things, not by forcing them into conceptual forms, but by sensing the feelings they generate. He will concern himself with these things, because they are like hints of the forces at play between things that happen, forces that are more than merely mechanical or mathematical. That was the first point. The second, which I want to keep on and on mentioning, is that despite today's materialism, much that is spiritual is being revealed to human beings. But people are embarrassed to say too much about spiritual experiences they may be having. When someone opens up a little and begins to tell you things because he has developed trust in you, you will hear about how one person did this or another did that. If a person tells you really honestly and candidly why he founded this newspaper or why he did something else, he is telling you a dream, something like a dream. He is describing these things as suggestions coming from the spiritual world. You will find this happening everywhere, much more than you would imagine. Many more things are put into practice out of spiritual impulses than you would think. Only people are embarrassed to admit to this, because others do not take them seriously if they talk about such things. So it is good to deepen your soul's attention in both these directions. Firstly, to watch closely when something happens that attracts your attention, but this might be a hint coming from somewhere. And, secondly, to notice how things are revealed to people out of the spiritual world, either in a good or a bad sense, things which give them the impulse to take action in some way. This happens nowadays more than one would imagine. These are the matters I wanted to draw to your attention today. Next Tuesday we shall talk further about them. Behind the Scenes of External Events, Part 2. In the lecture I gave here a week ago, I wanted to broach a subject that so much needs to be discussed. A subject that the present tragic events in human life are forcing us to face. A subject that could be defined briefly with the words, humanity urgently needs to find its way, once more, to knowledge and awareness of how what takes place here in the world, on the physical plane, is linked with a concrete spiritual world. Humanity urgently needs to become aware that a spiritual world is working down into every detail of existence in the physical world. It has to be said that, especially in our time, one must be aware of the need for consciousness of this to spread amongst humanity. As regards external physical appearance, present-day people are not very different from the human beings who lived in the past ages, about which history is ordinarily concerned. Ordinary historical research does not really go back further than at most about the third post-Atlantean age. What preceded that is only vaguely described by historians, but these vague descriptions are the only ones which people today are prepared to consider. Close parenthesis. However, in their soul life, human beings have changed a very great deal over the course of time since then. Even though it cannot be said that external physical life or the physical organism has changed all that much, so people do not notice, or are not eager to notice, what is actually happening, what is going on out of impulses coming from the spiritual world. In fact, we are living in momentous times. By this I am not referring to the silly remark, usually clothed in the words, "We are living in a time of transition." Of course we are, for every time is a time of transition. But the important thing is to know what it is that is making a transition. Whatever it is that is making a transition in our time, whatever is taking on new forms and undergoing important transformations, This is something of which we become aware when we are able to turn our attention not only to the lives of beings and creatures who go about here on the earth in physical bodies, but also to beings who do not belong to the physical world, including, of course, human beings who have died. In the world that human beings pass through between death and a new birth, one can notice great transformations, and those taking place just now are profoundly far-reaching. But people today are not at all eager to give serious consideration to matters of the spiritual world. And the fact that they do not take this at all seriously can lead for us to very special feelings when we think of how what we call anthroposophy is coming into being. In order to want to represent the ideas that are put forward by the anthroposophical movement, there is no need to feel any particular preference for them. This is different in other movements. And how many movements there are, and associations as well, all of which are convinced that what they want to present to the world is the most essential and necessary thing. The people in all those associations and movements are subjectively fanatical about their movement. They are prejudiced in favor of their program, and they consider their program to be the source of great bliss and an absolute necessity. But there is no need to be prejudiced in this way in favor of the anthroposophical movement, for the impulse to represent it can derive from something quite different. To put it briefly, which is so often necessary for us because we can have so little time together, I would say it like this. Having become convinced of the truth of anthroposophical ideas, what then impels us to do all we can to spread the ideas is our sympathy for the people of today who need these ideas. And these people are, actually, almost all those whom we meet. We are impelled by our sympathy for people who must have these ideas and who are doomed to take terrible things upon themselves if they do not have them. Last time, I endeavored to give you a picture of how things that are incomprehensible on the physical plane become comprehensible when they can be explained in the context of the spiritual world. Today I want to bring forward a number of other important points, which at first sight will appear to come from quite another direction. So, let us begin with something we encounter wherever we go. In many quarters, though it is regarded as a sign of a special religious enlightenment if one rejects ideas such as those which we have about what is encountered as soon as one steps across the threshold to the spiritual world, namely that there one is involved with many spiritual beings, with whole hierarchies of spiritual beings, angeloi, archangeloi, and so on, upward. Instead, it is regarded as a sign of special religious enlightenment if one merely reflects on what is called the one God, with whom one seeks to have as intimate and as direct a relationship as possible. This is regarded as the only possible monotheism, and some people are horrified to be told about teachings that speak of a multiplicity of spiritual beings. Let us be clear about what this means. When a person's only relationship with the spiritual world is the one that is regarded today in religious circles as the usual one, the one cultivated by a church that fancies itself as enlightened, then that person only has a specific relationship with the spiritual world, a relationship which, although it is one of feeling, only concerns the protecting angelos, the angel being with whom he does have a real relationship. And such a person then refers to that angel being, the only being he can relate to and have certain feelings for, as his God. If he is a Christian, he calls this angel being Christ. He mistakes the angel being for Christ. It is perhaps difficult to imagine this, but it is so. Protestant theologians who fancy themselves to be enlightened warn strongly against polytheism, so that people should gain a direct relationship with the one being, Christ. But however much they talk to people about Christ, what they are saying about Christ refers solely to the individual's relationship with his own angel being. Thus, in our time, monotheism is in danger of becoming the worship by each human being of his own individual angel. There is much that people do not yet want to admit, even though it lives among them as a reality. The objective observer, meanwhile, can see how they are beginning to develop all kinds of rather disastrous ideas and feelings out of such illusions. Because people each pray to their own angel, they each have their own God, while erroneously believing that they share their God with the others. In fact, the monotheists of today each pray only to their own angel. But as the words resound together, which each is speaking to his own angel, in an egoistic relationship with his own angel being, they think that they are talking to a God whom they all share. If this were to develop further, people as individual human beings would begin to develop more and more what we already see nations manifesting in a terrible way. Although still speaking theoretically of the one God, they do not seriously want to recognize this divinity, especially now, for each nation wants to have its own God. This is what comes to the fore in a general way. In reality, every human being today wants to have his own God. And so he uses the term monotheism for the relationship he has with only his own angelos being. Since all relationships are dulled in a time when the aim is to develop abilities to see solely what is sense perceptible, people do not notice that things are as I have just described them. In speaking about concrete relationships between human beings and the spiritual world, to people who have not as yet taken note of any anthroposophical concepts, we find everywhere that they do not want to go into such things. They shy away from entering into this subject. They do not want to muster the courage to connect their thoughts with impulses that are said to come from the spiritual world. Something like this has always been the case in times of crisis, and we are now living in a time of crisis. With exceedingly painful feelings, we have to observe how inattentive today's humanity is as regards the tragic events of the present time, which speak so eloquently and clearly. How disinclined people are to pay proper attention to the events of the present time apart from being forced to take note of the material circumstances. People really do have to be forced to notice that what is going on during these years is everywhere presenting human souls with profoundly incisive impulses for humanity. This is why people have not listened when they have been shown, by whatever means, that important, decisive things must be thought and done by today's humanity in order to extricate itself from the miseries of the present time, and that the things that have to be thought and done must be born out of spiritual knowledge, out of concrete spiritual facts. Constantly emphasizing the spiritual in a general way, while going on and on about how human beings should deepen themselves spiritually and so on, none of this leads anywhere. What matters is that the people of today must win through to concrete relationships with the spiritual world. For us, it is understandable that in earlier ages, when they had stronger connections with the spiritual world, people's attention was drawn to those concrete connections, whereas nowadays these are no longer comprehended. In earlier ages, People did not yet indulge in generalized chatter about humanity milling around down here on the earth while something divine hovered about up above. People then talked in concrete terms. The most beautiful and meaningful outpourings of such concrete relationships are to be found in prophecies such as those of Daniel or of the book of Revelation, which do not merely state, quote, "You human beings, you must put your trust in one God, you must believe in one God," close quote. Those writings tell of one kingdom, a second kingdom, a third kingdom, and how such kingdoms must follow one after the other. And they tell in concrete ways of the relationship of the spiritual world with the physical sense-perceptible earth. But humanity today has completely lost the habit of speaking in such concrete ways about the relationship between the spiritual and the physical. Humanity today wants to apply the same yardstick to everything and invent theories according to which people all over the globe may be awarded the same standard of earthly happiness. Today's socialist thinks that certain ideas apply equally to human life in England, America, Russia, or Asia. If every state were to arrange its affairs as socialism prescribes, then the happiness which people everywhere dream about would automatically ensue. That is what people think. But these are abstractions, unreal concepts and ideas. Not knowing that one thing is prepared in one location on the earth by one particular people, while another is prepared at another location, not having the ability to comprehend the great difference between West and East. This is what must cause endless confusion and endless chaos. Only those who can build a bridge from their soul to the objective facts can work in a beneficial way to shape earthly existence. But people do not want to build this bridge. Again and again just now, an inner necessity compels me to speak to our friends in various places about a certain event that took place during the final third of the 19th century, one that is significant and deeply incisive for human evolution, an event known to all the various occult schools, although they are often not able to give a correct account of how the event ran its course. Today, once again, I want to mention briefly what it is about. From the year 1841 onward, a battle of spirits took place in spiritual realms between certain beings of the higher hierarchies and other beings who were above them. The beings who rebelled in the years between 1841 and 1879, and who fought a battle of rebellion during that period, had earlier been employed in a positive way by the wise guides of the universe. Beings who at one time are rebellious and evil and become spirits of darkness are at other times beings whose services are used for the good. So I am speaking here of beings who until 1841 were employed by higher beings in the service of the wise guides of the world, but who from then onward had aims that differed from those of the superior beings. These beings fought a significant battle in the spiritual world, one of those battles that take place quite frequently, though at various levels, a battle that in legend is symbolized by the battle of Michael with the dragon. This battle ended in the autumn of 1879, with certain spirits of darkness being thrown down from the spiritual realms into the realm of the earth, since when they have been at work amongst human beings, entering into their will impulses, entering into their motivations, entering into whatever human beings can grasp in thought, in short, into everything connected with human beings. So, certain spirits of darkness have been amongst human beings since the autumn of 1879, and people must become aware of them if they are to understand earthly events. It is entirely correct to say that because these beings were thrown out in 1879, the heavens are now free of them, while the earth is full of them. The best way of describing what these beings wanted to achieve by means of their battle of rebellion from 1841 to 1879 is to say that they wanted to prevent the spiritual wisdom that must necessarily necessarily be revealed to human beings from the 20th century onward from entering into human souls. They wanted to retain the spiritual wisdom within the spiritual world and not let it enter into human souls. The only way of ensuring that the human sense for spiritual knowledge would be opened up from the 20th century onward was to remove the impeding spirits of darkness from the spiritual realm, so that the spiritual knowledge destined for human beings could come down. But now that those spirits of darkness are moving about amongst human beings here on earth, they are once again working to confuse people. Their aim now is to make sure that people fail to enter into the right relationship with the spiritual truths, so that the healing purpose of those truths is kept away from human beings. The only way of counteracting this is to apply clear recognition and understanding to these matters. But there are certain secret brotherhoods who have made it their task to work for the opposite of this. They want to have the wisdom only within their closest circle, so that they can use it in the service of their own lust for power. This is the battle we are now fighting. On the one hand, there is the need to guide humanity in the right way by letting people take in the spiritual wisdom. On the other, there are the closed, secret brotherhoods of a nasty kind, whose very aim is not to let the wisdom enter into humanity, so that people will remain stupid and foolish as far as the spiritual world is concerned, while those within the closely guarded brotherhoods carry on their machinations from there. The events of the present time are full of whole bundles of these machinations, and it will be especially calamitous for humanity if people fail to recognize that such machinations are at work. You will feel as though a kind of light has been turned on regarding what is happening behind these matters when I tell you of certain truths that, like ripe plums dropping from a tree, are meant to drop down out of the spiritual world into the human realm, but are being prevented from spreading also because people have presuppositions and misconceptions about them and are afraid of them. I would like to speak about this in terms that are as concrete as possible. Important, significant consequences arise out of the fact that a number of spirits of darkness were thrown out in 1879 and have since dwelt in the human realm. The main consequence of this fact is that since then, clear thinking, has become immeasurably more important for human beings than was formerly the case. Never before has there been a time when clear thinking has been as necessary for human evolution as are eating and drinking for the preservation of the physical body. For if people think about clarity now in our time and on into the future, they will not be able to see in the right light those ripe truths that are to drop down from the spiritual world. Above all, they will not understand the great and profound significance for the whole of human evolution of the mystery of Golgotha, the appearance of Christ within the evolution of humanity. Many people talk about Christ Jesus, but to talk about the profound significance accorded to the whole of human evolution on the earth by the mystery of Golgotha, this is something that today's theology actually wants to prevent. There has, of course, only been a slow and gradual development of what is going to come about through the mystery of Golgotha, and it will only come to the fore in its full intensity during our present century. In olden times, there still existed faculties inherited from the ages when human beings had an atavistic inner life filled with spirituality. Only in our age has it become necessary for people to work at achieving spirituality, if this is what they want to have. That is why certain quite specific manifestations are arising in our time, in fact from 1879 onward. Because our outer vision has become so coarse, we can only see these things clearly when we look with the eyes of our soul into the realm which human beings enter after stepping through the gate of death. There we see that the manner in which souls born prior to 1879 re-enter the spiritual world after death is different from how all those souls will arrive back who have been born since 1879. This is a profoundly incisive event. This profoundly incisive event has the effect, especially, that in their souls, human beings become increasingly similar to their thoughts, to what they regard as their understanding of things. This may be a strange truth for the people of today, but it is a truth nevertheless. It is important and essential to see certain things in the right light, with clear thoughts, with valid thoughts, with thoughts imbued through and through with reality. To see Darwinism correctly, for example, as I endeavored to present it yesterday in a public lecture, this is good. But to see it as the basis for the only valid view of the world, to see it as meaning that only one thing is correct, namely that the human being is descended from the animals, to have the living thought about oneself, quote, I am descended from the animals, I have originated only out of the same forces that also form the animals, close quote. All this leads souls nowadays to resemble their own inner pictures. It is important to know this. When a soul like this has laid aside its body, it undergoes the misfortune of having to see itself as resembling its own inner pictures. Those who believe, while in the physical body, that only animal forces have played a part in their development, are building for themselves a consciousness after death with which they will have to perceive themselves as animals. For now that the event of 1879 is properly brought to fulfillment the character of the fifth post-Atlantean age, the thoughts which human beings make for themselves serve to make human souls become transformed into these thoughts. That is why I said earlier that there is no need to have any particular preference for the spiritual science of anthroposophy in order to want to represent it. All one needs is sympathy with those who use such thoughts. These thoughts are creative thoughts in the life of the soul, because human beings are destined in the future to become what they regard themselves to be. This is something that had to come about during the course of wisely guided world evolution, so that the human being might really attain to a full and free consciousness of self. One aspect is that the gods had to give the human being the possibility of becoming his own creation. The other aspect is that in order for the human being to be able to give this self-created being a supersensible purpose, in order for him to be able to find in what he has made of himself something that can give him an eternal direction for the future, for this it was that Christ Jesus entered into the mystery of Golgotha. If one understands Christ Jesus through spiritual science, if one understands him in one's thoughts, then one can find the way to him, the way from the animal nature to the divine. This truth becomes especially evident to those who can look with the eyes of the soul into the realm which human beings enter after death. Those born before 1879 still take a certain remnant back with them, which protects them from becoming only what they were able to imagine while here on earth. And indeed, for some time to come, people will still be protected from becoming what they have imagined themselves to be. For these things only come into effect gradually. But paradoxically, this protection will only be made possible through suffering. It will only be possible if they can take upon themselves the suffering of knowledge, by which they themselves sense the unsatisfactory nature of their ideas about the human being. Harmony with oneself, coupled with knowledge that allows the human being to be human after death, This will only come about in the future if human beings become aware, while they are here in the physical body, of their true connections with the spiritual world. Those whose materialistic ideas still make them reject concrete spiritual knowledge today will take a long time before being able to accept that the year 1879 brought with it this kind of change. Yet it is necessary for such knowledge to be accepted. So you see how important it is, and how much more important it will become in the future, that the spiritual knowledge available should be allowed to spread throughout the earth. But meanwhile, in order to promote their affairs, the spirits of darkness will place a special emphasis on creating confusion amongst human beings, so that they fail to form the right thoughts into which they will be transformed after death. The human being has to become what he thinks himself to be. This is a truth that was destined to become known by human beings from the time in the 19th century onward, when those important changes came about. Human beings must will to be what they can in reality be. They must be able to think about their being if they are to be that being in their soul. Even today, those who have died will be able to announce as a rightful, mature truth, quote, "The soul is what it is able to think itself to be," close quote. Yet, since the time when it has become necessary to spread the truth, quote, "The soul is what it is able to think itself to be," close quote, since that time, the spirits of darkness have managed to inspire into people what they represent as the truth, which is, quote, "The human being is what he eats," close quote. Although the maxim, "the human being is what he eats," is not recognized theoretically amongst the broader population, nevertheless people live their lives in practice as though they do agree that the human being really is nothing more than what he eats. In fact, life as it is lived in practice is aiming more and more to bring this to the fore in outer life as well. More than anyone might believe, very much more than anyone might believe, the sad and tragic events of the present time have arisen as a consequence of the principle, "the human being is what he eats." In a far more profound sense than is realized by today's superficial way of thinking, it is these very lowly things that are causing so much blood to flow. Humanity has indeed been inoculated with the sentence, "The human being is what he eats," and many battles are being fought about matters that are connected with such things. Especially for this reason, it is so necessary for thoughts that are fitting for our age to be spread about. Thought will gradually have to be recognized as a real soul force, rather than the pitiable abstraction which modern times have turned it into, and are now so proud of as well. In bygone ages, there was still an ancient heritage that linked humanity with the spiritual world. But although that atavistic clairvoyance more or less vanished many centuries ago, the ancient heritage has still been present in the feeling and the will. But now the time has come when what is conscious must come more and more to the fore as a real force. And that is why in our time the spirits of opposition, the spirits of darkness, are rushing to the attack in order to counteract genuine thought with abstract thoughts in the form of all kinds of world programs. The connection between these things must be clearly seen. People must understand that the thought as such must become more and more real. There are still today so many people who say, quote, "Well, we shall see what comes after death. We'll find out about it all in good time. But there's no need to bother about it just now, while we serve life. Once we enter that other world over there, we'll see quite clearly what it is like." Close quote. In fact, if the one thing is true, namely that over there we are what we have here imagined about ourselves, then there is also something else that is true. Consider a thought that is not at all rare today, when someone has died and left relatives behind. If the latter are perhaps not without thoughts, although tending to be materialistic, they cannot help having the thought that their dead relative is decaying in the grave, or that they still have what remains of him collected up in an urn or such like. Well, so long as people are without thoughts, they can be materialists and yet not have this belief. But if materialism triumphs, then people will increasingly believe all that is left of the dead person is decaying in the urn or in the grave. This thought is a real force. It is an untruth. If those left behind think that the dead person is no longer alive, and that he is no longer here, then this is an erroneous thought. But this erroneous thought is nevertheless real and actual in the souls of the people who think it. And the dead person perceives this real thought. He perceives it as something very significant for himself. It is not unimportant, but in fact profoundly important. If those who remain behind here cultivate in their living inner soul life the thought of the dead person continuing to live in the spiritual world, or if they merely give way to the lament, "He's dead, that's all, he is decaying," these two things are not equally valid, for they are actually very essentially different. It is now scarcely possible to be here in Zurich without everywhere coming up against what people call analytical psychology, psychoanalysis, which is now being carried on everywhere, but especially strongly here. These psychoanalysts, it must be said, are now beginning to pay attention to matters of spirit and soul. They are beginning to think about spirit and soul because they are being so strongly confronted with this element. Readers aside, I would like to make this mention. This volume 178 that I'm reading does not have two of its lectures that are in the original Collected Works volume 178 in it, but I have recorded them, and I'm going to append them to this and make it a complete collected work, even though the book itself is not. And I just wanted to say that those two are on specifically psychoanalysis, just so you'll know that. End of readers aside, back to the book. I would here like to describe in a few words one particular feature of this psychoanalysis. Think of someone who suffers from hysterical symptoms. Hysterical symptoms are being especially noticed now because of the form they take these days. In any age, close attention is paid to those disorders that manifest particularly strongly in that age. People seek to find where the causes might lie. Well, psychoanalysis has now reached the point where it is saying that these hysterical symptoms, which manifest so frequently, have their causes in the soul. It cannot find the causes in the material realm, in the physiological or biological element, so they must lie in the soul realm. The favored place for seeking all kinds of causes for various hysterical symptoms lies, at present, in the subconscious soul realm. They say, quote, "Here is someone who manifests hysterical symptoms. They arise because what is at work in him lies not in his consciousness, but beneath the threshold of his consciousness, whence it keeps rising up like a subterranean wave, a subsoulian wave." Close quote. This is the beginning of a dangerous game. The psychoanalysts search for all kinds of isolated, subterranean, hidden soul provinces, as they call it. In someone who is 30 years old, they look for aberrations in his 7th year, which were not lived through fully at that time. These must be brought back into his consciousness, because bringing things back into consciousness is supposed to heal, and so on. This is a game with extremely dangerous weapons. Out on the physical battlefield, people are today fighting with very dangerous weapons. But here, in many fields, a game is being played with weapons of knowledge that are no less dangerous. because people lack the will to deepen their knowledge through spiritual science in order to reach a real understanding of the symptoms that rise up before their souls. They tackle the matter with inadequate tools of knowledge, and that is a dangerous game. It is perfectly true to say that subconscious elements which fail to rise up into consciousness do play a part in many people nowadays. But what the psychoanalysts imagine they have found is, as a rule, the very least significant part. And that is why their successes in healing patients are on the whole rather questionable. When you find that a woman of 30 underwent some sort of sexual aberration in her 14th year, which was not fully lived through, so that the consequences continue to grow wildly and cause hysteria, what you have actually discovered is the most inconsequential aspect of the matter. In one case or another, what you discover might in fact be quite correct, but it will lead to even greater misunderstanding if its full import is not understood. One thing above all, though, is certainly true, and that is that countless subconscious elements do indeed haunt human beings today, and they are much harassed by these, and the diseases of civilization are caused by them. What is this? Consider what I have already said. The thought of the dead person who is no longer here lives in the soul. It lives somehow without the soul thinking about it much. It lives only because the soul is today still without thought, and the soul is rather sensitive with regard to such thoughtless thoughts. When this happens, the dead person is forced by eternal, universal laws to live with this thought. The dead person haunts the soul of the living person who has remained behind. The only way to counteract this is by knowing that the dead person lives. People on the physical plane will be more and more driven into soul illnesses by their lack of belief that the dead are alive. As a rule, it is not youthful sexual aberrations that bring about these diseases, but thoughts that do not believe. For in our time, thoughts are called upon to become real forces. They are called upon to become real forces, but not only forces that work for themselves. They work for themselves when after death the soul increasingly resembles what it imagined itself to be while it was in the body. But these thoughts become real forces in a higher sense as well, in that they even bind beings, in this case those who have died, in a wrong way to those who are still alive. The only way to counteract this is by maintaining, as far as one can, a connection with the one who has died, in that one regards him as continuing to live. This saves the relationship with the dead person from becoming a disaster, not only for oneself who has remained behind, but also in some ways for the dead person who is necessitated by an eternal, wisdom-filled law to haunt the one who has remained behind in a way that does not come to the consciousness of that person, but manifests purely in symptoms of disease. So what is the real remedy for many of the symptoms which psychoanalysts are encountering today? The remedy is to spread knowledge about the spiritual world. This is the universal remedy, the universal therapy, and not those individual therapies that are bestowed upon individual patients. So you see, life is calling on us not to think that while we are here we should pay attention only to physical life, while imagining that when we step through the gate of death, it will be soon enough to find out what kind of a world we shall discover there. For it is a fact that just as our life here is important for the life we shall enter between death and a new birth, so is the life of souls between death and a new birth important for the souls here. What I have been telling you is a thought, the thought of disbelieving the existence of those who have died. but the dead are and should be linked to the living by many bonds. And what I have been speaking about is only one of those bonds. There are also many other legitimate bonds which are needed to bring about the proper connections with the spiritual world. Spiritual science, the spiritual science of anthroposophy, searches for the right connections. The life human beings lead with one another here on the earth will only follow a correct course if people here on the earth enter into a proper relationship with the spiritual world. Otherwise, it will become more and more possible for individuals to become presumptuous and embark on machinations such as those I spoke of last Tuesday in order to gain power over others. There is one thing, especially, about which we must be clear. When we look toward the east, where just now the events that are happening are very intensive signs of something, we shall only gain an understanding of this if we gain inward clarity about the nature of what is there in the East. Look at what we have been saying for years about the inclinations of the Eastern peoples in relation to the sixth post-Atlantean cultural age. This will bring clarity about all that is so confusing, which has come from the East, because out of what is happening, now something quite different must develop. Something it will not be easy to be so complacent about. The important thing to do is to find an entry in the right way into all those streams that are appearing just now, and will continue to appear even more in the future. And the right entry can be found by pressing forward to knowledge about the spiritual world that can be discovered in the right way through spiritual science. In this way, too, the right relationship with the spiritual world can be found. Last time, I drew your attention to a wrong relationship with the spiritual world, which is being sought in a particular quarter. I told you that quite specific machinations were being used to dispatch people away from life here and up into the spiritual world in such a way that their life here had not been fully lived, so that they could still make use of certain forces once they had entered into the world in which we live between death and a new birth. Then, certain unscrupulous brotherhoods, who only want to satisfy their own lust for power, can use mediums in order to bring into the world some specific knowledge that can come from those who have died once they have been given the possibility of acquiring such knowledge. These secret brotherhoods are, as a rule, also the ones that mislead people with regard to the most important matters to do with the spiritual world. I have told you that in November 1879, an important event took place, a battle between the forces of darkness and the forces of light, of which the outcome is depicted in the image of Michael and the dragon. What is important about this, however, is not the fact that I have told you about it, for this was an event that had to happen, an event that was predestined in world evolution, about which you can read in many different books, so that it is a truth that is not at all esoteric. The important thing is that I endeavor to make clear to you the true significance of what actually happened, and also the proper way in which human beings should relate to this event. That is what is important. The fact that this event was coming was known to Eliphas Levi, to Bader, to St. Martin, all of whom wrote about it. There is nothing at all esoteric about it. But in our time, there are ongoing efforts to create confusion about such events in people's heads. Perhaps so much confusion that human heads take such things to be nothing but superstition, and not real, even though knowledge about them has already been put about by older scholars who are in the know. That is why it is important to be given appropriate concepts about these things. Today there is a proper path along which one can approach the spiritual truths that have been seeping down into the physical world from the spiritual world. This proper path is the one shown by spiritual science. And if the stream of this spiritual science does not stray from the pure and genuine will, then it will lead people to a right relationship between the physical world and the spiritual world. But to attain what must be attained and brought to people is a strenuous business requiring effort. The comfortable attitudes people have today will have to be put aside, for effort is required. When one speaks about impulses that work down from the spiritual world and will also play a part in shaping the future, it happens repeatedly that people come who want specific information about one thing or another. Such people want to be told, for example, exactly what will come out of the present war in 1920. Such people fail to grasp that it is not permitted to burden the future by elaborating on every detail, but that in spite of this, knowledge about the future can be absolutely certain, effective and certain, and that one must take account of it. It is so very difficult to make people understand this. Let me use an example to clarify this, since you are likely to say, "What does he mean?" On the one hand, he tells us that details are harmful to knowledge of the future, and on the other hand, he says one should listen carefully to this knowledge about the future, because it brings forward true things about the future. Close quote. I want to use a really simple example to show you what I mean. Imagine a bad and a good chess player. A bad chess player will make bad moves. He will not do any good and will lose the game. A good player will have more opportunities and will win the game. The bad chess player simply makes wrong moves, while the good one makes the right moves at the right time. But does the good player waste his thoughts on working out in detail what moves his opponent might make later on? As a good player must, he knows now what moves his opponent will make in 2 hours. No, there is no need for him to know this. Yet even without this knowledge, his art of playing chess correctly and well does not remain without effect. When the future comes, he will do the right thing because he has insight into what the right moves are, and he will do the wrong thing if he has no insight into what the right moves are. He cannot avoid facing up to the free will of his opponent. So you cannot ask, quote, "What is the use of being able to play chess properly if the opponent is present?" Close quote. In fact, there is a great deal of use in being able to play chess properly. If you think more profoundly about this comparison, I am sure you will discover what I mean. This comparison will also show you the relevance of what anyone who is knowledgeable about esoteric matters will tell you. That as soon as you derive the impulses for your actions in the physical world out of the spiritual world, you must, at that same moment, be prepared to be confronted by other spiritual powers, that you will have opponents with whom you will have to reckon, that there will be no free space where you can put everything into action. This is what is uncomfortable in these things. Get to know esoteric impulses that have been called down from the spiritual world, and then try, perhaps as a politician, to put them into practice. If you are a true contemporary of the present age, you will much prefer it if everything runs smoothly, if these impulses simply flow in while you regulate everything. But if you have effective spiritual impulses, especially esoteric impulses, which you want to apply in the physical world, you will everywhere have to reckon not only with the free will of people in this world, but also of higher beings. So as things stand today, you cannot reckon with finding a free space in front of you. You will have to realize that you will be working in a space that is already well filled. So the important thing is to get to know, through a genuine spiritual science, the right things, for example, about the nature of the sixth post-Atlantean cultural age, which is being prepared over in the East, and then to carry out the right esoteric impulse in each individual situation. just as the chess player makes his moves according to the moves of his opponent. The important thing, really, is that one must learn to find a living entry into the spiritual world, and then do the right thing in each individual case. It is not simply overall abstract programs that are important, but a heightening of one's spiritual vitality, a continuous exercising of effort. People want abstract programs nowadays. They want to hear stated in 5 sentences what should be done all over the world. They want delegates to be sent from every state on earth who will meet in a world tribunal and vote on everything that is to happen all over the earth in accordance with an accepted norm. Yet the important thing to realize is that knowledge of the spiritual world is what is required of human beings, a continuous effort to make contact with the spiritual world. This, though, is linked with something else. It is linked with the fact that one has to reckon with the forces that are one's opponents and cannot simply rely on one's own powers. The opponents have to be reckoned with. But this has nothing to do with the idea of power. Impulses brought down from the esoteric world will be the right ones and will bring about what is right. And it will never be possible to use them in the service of power as such. That is impossible. What must one do? If one wants to work in the service of power factors as such. Let me read that again. What must one do if one wants to work in the service of power factors as such? One must try to gain knowledge about the future in an improper way, as I described last time, by dispatching people through death in a manner that enables them to retain the use of earthly powers and then getting them to impart what is to happen through mediums. In this way, certain secret brotherhoods have gained some portions of knowledge about the relationship of the West to the East, and all kinds of machinations have been set in train which are functioning in accordance with that knowledge. For knowledge that is placed at the disposal of the lust for power seeks to attain something entirely specific. The honest, proper acquisition of esoteric impulses only puts into practice what takes account also of the angelos being of each individual living person. One knows that every individual with regard to whom one is using esoteric impulses is also a soul who has a relationship with the spiritual world. One regards such a one as a living being. The way in which the West ought to be treating the East should everywhere involve being open to the possibility of reckoning with the living partners, the angels who protect each individual human being. But this is irksome. Those others want to get rid of this influence by means of Ahrimanic powers, so that power alone can hold sway on this side. But such a thing can only be brought about by gaining possession of the impulses for the future in the wrong way, as I described last time. Our age is suffering immensely from the way impulses gained in the manner described are playing a part in the events that happen. The whole task of those who seek the truth in an honest way today involves, in the first place, the duty to convince oneself that impulses, in the bad sense, do exist, and to convince oneself that the only way to work into the future in the right way is through finding the right impulses in the proper way by the path of spiritual science. Dear friends, you can see from this that to serve spiritual science is not a one-sided matter, for it is a service rendered by both the living and the dead. It is an earnest matter. What I wanted to do just now, when our friends here in Zurich are preparing to bring spiritual science into suitable circles, was to speak within our society here about those earnest matters of spiritual knowledge in recent and present times. It is noticeable even within our society how various opposing powers are at work. Only consider what has been going on, roughly since this war began, by way of defamations and accusations of the will, which I and others are experiencing. In this too, opposing powers are obviously playing their part. From the way we have been speaking during these considerations, it will have become clear to you that our time needs a renewal of its spiritual life, and that it needs people to wake up from a kind of sleeping state. Again and again we meet people who think, quote, "Well, now there is a war, but after that peace will come, and then the matter will be done with." Close quote. But this is not how things are. The things that are happening today are significant signs, but they are incomprehensible to anyone who does not want to deepen his soul life through spiritual science. And because the times are so serious, because it will become more and more difficult to fight even the kind of battle our friends here have fought in order to make such functions as this one possible, I want to mention this circumstance especially, and in this case also with my utmost gratitude. I want to mention it with gratitude on the one hand, out of the mood of spiritual science, and on the other, because our dear friends here in Zurich have taken up the battle against unfavorable circumstances so kindly and with such energy, and have not spared themselves any effort to make these lectures possible under these very unfavorable circumstances. So, the fine aim these Zurich friends set themselves has been realized, even though it will become increasingly difficult to organize such events owing to the increasing resistance of these times. I especially want to mention the fact that these difficulties will continue to increase more and more. So we must realize that we shall have to make the best use in the near future of the time we can still fight for in which to put on our lectures. And that is why I wanted to express these thanks to our dear Zurich friends, who have made the greatest efforts to enable both the public and the branch lectures to take place. Later, when we look back over these things, we will surely realize how significant it is that we have been able to be together and speak together in this way, just at the present time, when such tragic events are taking place in the world. So, let us continue to work in the sense of the spiritual scientific impulse, and endeavor to do whatever can be wrested from the difficult circumstances of this time in the conviction which can arise in us out of a true understanding of spiritual science, that in the great stream of today's tragic and devastating events, we are doing something very important and incisive for this age. What we are doing is something that is flowing into the stream of events. That this is happening may not be very obvious just now, but it is significant nonetheless. If this thought can imbue us, then it will give us the strength to carry on. This thought will have the strength within it to send out beams into our time in the right way. Such thoughts must be absorbed and accepted by our time. Let us live in this conviction as though in an atmosphere of spirit. It can come to us out of spiritual science if we understand this spiritual science in the right way. Let us remain together in this sense.